Imagine being stopped by a police officer and realizing that for the next several minutes, your freedom is no longer entirely in your hands. You are told where to stand, where to sit, whether you can leave, and in some cases, your hands are placed behind your back and secured. You may be frightened, frustrated, embarrassed, or simply trying to cooperate because you understand that resisting an officer can make an already difficult situation much worse. Now imagine that the very person who has been given legal authority over your body begins using that authority to violate your boundaries. That is what makes the story of former Missouri police officer Marcellis Blackwell so difficult to comprehend. On August 10, 2026, Blackwell appeared in federal court in St. Louis and pleaded guilty to 18 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, involving 18 men he had detained or arrested while serving as an officer with the North County Police Cooperative. According to the Justice Department, all 18 counts involved abusive contact of a sexual nature, and 15 of the counts also involved kidnapping conduct. 16 of the 18 men were handcuffed when the abuse occurred. 15 were taken to isolated locations. In multiple encounters, Blackwell disabled his body-worn camera, and he admitted that on 13 occasions he falsified reports by saying his camera had remained active when it had not. Think about those numbers for a moment. 18 men, 16 restrained in handcuffs, 15 taken away from public view, 13 reports containing false information about body camera use. This was not one interaction that was misunderstood or one allegation that remained unresolved. Blackwell has now entered a guilty plea and admitted the conduct involving those 18 men. But this story is also bigger than one former police officer. It forces us to talk about male victims of SA, consent when one person possesses overwhelming authority, the vulnerabilities of people who have been detained, the importance of body camera accountability, and the uncomfortable reality that men can experience serious violations while remaining almost invisible in our larger conversations about victimization. Trigger warning. Before we continue, I want to give you a clear trigger warning. This video discusses SA, abuse of authority, coercion, restrained individuals, police misconduct, and violations of bodily boundaries. I will not provide graphic descriptions of what happened, and throughout this video I will generally use the abbreviation SA rather than repeating explicit terminology. The purpose of this conversation is not shock value. It is accountability, education, respect for the men involved, and a deeper examination of what happens when enormous authority is placed in the wrong hands. Before we go deeper, subscribe to Life Points with Ronda, turn on your notifications, and share this video with someone who believes that conversations about SA must include male survivors as well. I especially want men to hear this story because there are still powerful cultural expectations telling men that they should always be strong enough to protect themselves, that certain violations should be laughed off, or that acknowledging victimization somehow diminishes masculinity. Those ideas do not protect men, they protect silence. And as you listen, remember that this is not an indictment of every police officer. This is a documented federal civil rights case involving one former officer who has now admitted his conduct in court. We can respect honorable law enforcement while simultaneously demanding serious accountability when someone abuses the authority attached to a badge. Welcome to Life Points with Ronda, where we examine relationships, culture, human behavior, accountability, personal transformation, and the stories happening around us that leave behind lessons much larger than the headline. I know that your time is valuable, so let's get started and dive into this case. Because the central question is not simply what Marcellis Blackwell did. The deeper question is what happens when someone realizes that their position gives them extraordinary control over vulnerable people and then begins using that control for personal exploitation. WHO is Marcellis Blackwell, and what did he admit? Marcellis Blackwell worked as an officer with the North County Police Cooperative in the St. Louis area. According to the Department of Justice, the conduct covered by his guilty plea occurred between November 8, 2022 and June 5, 2023. On August 10, 2026, the 6-year-old pleaded guilty in federal court to 18 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, specifically involving the constitutional right to bodily integrity. The Justice Department says the encounters generally followed traffic stops or arrests. The terminology may sound technical, but the underlying principle is extremely important. An officer acts under color of law when exercising authority made possible by his government position. That badge, patrol vehicle, authority to detain, ability to arrest, and power to physically restrain another person all come from the state. The federal case is therefore not merely about one individual committing inappropriate acts. It is about a person allegedly, and now, through his plea, admittedly using government authority as part of the mechanism through which people were harmed. That is why this belongs in the category of civil rights. Being stopped by police does not mean surrendering ownership of your body. Being arrested does not mean surrendering your humanity. Having an outstanding warrant does not mean another person receives unlimited power over you. Even when the government has lawful authority to temporarily restrict someone's movement, that person retains fundamental rights. The numbers tell us this was a pattern. The Justice Department says Blackwell admitted abusing 18 men during a period of roughly 7 months. 16 of those men were handcuffed when the incidents occurred. 15 were taken to remote or isolated locations, including a high school and the rear parking area of Blackwell's own police department. That matters because patterns reveal something individual incidents may hide. If one person comes forward, people sometimes ask whether there was a misunderstanding. If a second person comes forward, skeptics may still search for another explanation. But as the number grows, investigators are able to compare accounts, timelines, locations, methods, records, and behavior. And when we hear that 16 men were handcuffed, we need to understand what that means in the conversation about consent. Handcuffs are not symbolic. They physically limit someone's ability to move and protect themselves. The officer also possesses legal authority, carries equipment associated with enforcement, and can potentially create additional consequences for the detained person. That is an enormous imbalance of power. The body camera detail may be one of the most important parts, according to the Justice Department. Before taking some of the men to remote locations, Blackwell deactivated his body-worn camera. He also admitted falsifying reports on 13 occasions by claiming that his body camera had remained active throughout his interactions with the individuals he arrested. That detail should concern everyone regardless of how they feel about policing generally. Body cameras were adopted in large part because recorded encounters can create an objective record of what took place. They can protect citizens, and they can also protect officers against false accusations. But the camera can only serve that function when recording policies are followed and unexplained gaps receive scrutiny. This case raises an important institutional question without requiring us to make accusations against people who have not been charged. When an officer repeatedly has missing body camera footage during significant encounters, what systems should exist to detect that pattern? Technology alone does not create accountability. Someone has to review it. Someone has to notice anomalies. Someone has to ask why recording stopped. The lesson extends beyond policing. A safeguard is only as effective as the system enforcing it. One man's report helped open the door. The Justice Department says the investigation began on June 4, 2023, when one of Blackwell's victims contacted the North County Police Cooperative regarding an encounter from the previous day. As additional men came forward, the FBI eventually took over the investigation. That sequence is incredibly important because the first person to report abuse rarely knows how large the story may become. He may believe he is the only one. He may expect to be doubted. He may fear embarrassment. He may wonder whether reporting an officer to other officers will accomplish anything. Yet one person decided to speak. Then other men came forward. I want us to remember that whenever somebody asks, why didn't more people speak earlier? People often remain silent because they believe they are alone. Sometimes, the moment another person speaks publicly or an investigation becomes known, a survivor recognizes the pattern and realizes that what happened to him may have happened to someone else. That does not mean every allegation in every case is automatically true. Allegations still require investigation and evidence. But it does mean silence should never be treated as evidence that something did not happen. Why we must talk about male survivors differently. This story forces us to confront the way society talks about male victims. Men are frequently raised with expectations that they should be physically dominant, emotionally controlled, and always capable of defending themselves. When a man experiences SA or another serious violation, those expectations can become another source of harm. People may ask why he did not fight harder. They may question what the incident says about his sexuality. They may make jokes. They may tell him that a real man would have prevented it. Every one of those responses misunderstands abuse. A person can be physically strong and still be victimized. A person can be heterosexual, gay, bisexual, or anything else, and still experience SA. Orientation does not determine whether consent existed. And when the other person is an armed officer who controls whether you remain detained, whether additional charges could be brought, where you are transported, and whether force could potentially be used, the question of why didn't he fight becomes even more unreasonable. For some people, surviving the moment means complying until they reach safety. That is not consent, that is survival. HANDCOFFS change everything about the power dynamic. We talk frequently about consent in romantic relationships, but consent must also be understood in situations involving authority. Consent requires meaningful freedom. If one person has overwhelming control over the other person's movements and immediate circumstances, we must examine that imbalance seriously. 16 of the men involved in Blackwell's guilty plea were handcuffed. That is not a minor detail surrounding the case. It is central to understanding it. Imagine having your hands restrained while the person controlling your detention begins crossing bodily boundaries. You may fear that resisting will be interpreted as assaulting an officer. You may fear being injured. You may fear additional charges. You may simply freeze because the situation is so unexpected that your brain cannot immediately process what is happening. This is why we must stop treating resistance as the measurement of victimization. People respond to frightening situations differently. Some fight. Some run when escape is possible. Some freeze. Some comply, because compliance appears to be the safest path out of the situation. The responsibility belongs to the person abusing the power, not to the victim for failing to respond according to somebody else's idea of what strength should look like. Detained people still have rights. There is another uncomfortable attitude that often appears whenever victims have criminal records, outstanding warrants, or were under arrest when something happened. Some people begin thinking that because the individual was accused of doing something wrong, the harm done to them somehow matters less. That way of thinking is dangerous. A person can commit a traffic violation and still possess civil rights. A person can have an outstanding warrant and still possess bodily integrity. A person can be suspected of a crime and still deserve protection from abuse. Even someone ultimately convicted of a crime does not become available for exploitation by government employees. The rule of law means limitations apply in both directions. Citizens are required to obey laws, but government officials are also restricted by laws governing how authority can be exercised. If rights only belong to people we approve of, they are not really rights. They are privileges. What the original case said versus what Blackwell has now admitted. There is an important factual distinction I want to make, because you may encounter different numbers when researching this case. In January 2024, a federal grand jury returned a superseding indictment accusing Blackwell of violating the rights of 9 men and brought a total of 36 federal charges, including 19 civil rights counts and 17 counts of altering records. At that stage, those were allegations, and Blackwell was legally presumed innocent. The case now stands differently. His August 2026 guilty plea covers 18 men and 18 deprivation of rights counts. 15 of those counts also involved kidnapping conduct. That is why you may hear one news report say 19 and another say 18. The number 19 comes from the earlier indictment. The number 18 comes from what Blackwell has now admitted in his federal guilty plea. When discussing serious cases, those distinctions matter. We should never make a story more sensational by blurring accusations and admissions. The confirmed facts are already extraordinary enough. This is also a story about institutional safeguards. It is easy to look at this story and conclude that the solution is simply removing one dangerous person. Obviously, individual accountability matters. But the bigger lesson is examining systems. If an employee occupies a position giving them access to vulnerable people, what safeguards exist? If documentation repeatedly does not match objective evidence, who reviews it? If technology designed to monitor interactions goes offline, how often does that trigger scrutiny? If complaints arise, how quickly are they investigated? These are questions every institution should ask, not only police departments. Hospitals need safeguards around patients. Schools need safeguards around students. Religious institutions need safeguards around congregants. Counseling professions need safeguards around clients. Elder care facilities need safeguards around residents. Whenever someone has authority over a vulnerable person, accountability cannot depend solely on hoping the person with power has good character. Good systems anticipate that eventually someone may not. The badge should make the standard higher, not lower. There are honorable officers who go to work every day and take seriously the responsibility they have been given. In fact, misconduct such as this also harms them because every abuse of authority weakens public trust in everyone wearing the same uniform. That is why accountability should never be framed as being anti-police. Accountability protects legitimate policing. If the badge represents authority, it must also represent restraint. If an officer is given greater power than the average person, then the ethical expectation should become greater as well. We should never create a system where criticism of misconduct is interpreted as criticism of every person in the profession. That only makes meaningful reform harder. You can respect the institution and still demand that the institution remove people who betray its purpose. In fact, that may be one of the clearest forms of respect for what the institution is supposed to represent. What happens next? Blackwell is scheduled to be sentenced on November 24, 2026. According to the Justice Department, federal prosecutors intend to request a sentence of 30 years in prison. The final sentence will ultimately be determined by the court. That sentencing will close one legal chapter, but it will not erase what these men experienced. Criminal accountability and healing are not the same thing. A prison sentence can punish an offender and remove him from the position he abused. It cannot automatically restore a victim's sense of safety, dignity, trust, or comfort during future encounters with authority. That is why public conversations should not end with, "How many years did he get?" The deeper questions remain. What support is available to the people affected? What institutional lessons are being learned? What safeguards change because this happened? And what does society need to understand differently about male victims so the next person does not spend years believing he has to remain silent? The real story is about power. Strip away the uniform, the courthouse, and the headline, and the central issue becomes power. Power itself is not evil. Parents have power, teachers have power, doctors have power, managers have power, spiritual leaders have power, police officers have power. The moral question is, what happens after someone receives it? Does authority make them more responsible or more entitled? Do they see vulnerable people as individuals deserving protection, or as people unlikely to be believed if something goes wrong? Can the person with power tolerate accountability, or do they begin believing their position protects them from consequences? Character is often easiest to discuss when somebody has very little power. Power reveals what someone does when the ability to cross another person's boundaries becomes available. Here is the life point I want you to carry away from the Marcellis Blackwell case. Never confuse authority with morality, and never mistake silence for consent. A badge tells us that someone was given a job and certain legal powers. It cannot tell us who that person is when nobody appears to be watching. Handcuffs may restrict someone's movement. They do not erase their humanity. An arrest may temporarily remove someone's freedom. It does not remove their ownership of their own body. And being a man does not make someone immune to fear, coercion, shame, or trauma. One of the most important cultural changes we can make is creating an environment where men understand that they can speak about violations without having their masculinity questioned. We also need institutions where people believe reporting misconduct will lead to an actual investigation rather than retaliation or humiliation. The person who finally speaks may believe he is telling the story of one incident. He may actually be opening the door to an entire pattern. If this story changed the way you think about male survivors, consent, police authority, or institutional accountability, subscribe to Life Points with Ronda, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this conversation. And I want to hear from you in the comments, but please keep this discussion respectful because survivors of SA may be reading what you write. What concerns you most about this case? The number of men involved, the fact that 16 were handcuffed, the isolated locations, the body camera issue, or the broader question of how people in positions of authority should be monitored? This story is serious, but the conversation does not need to become graphic or disrespectful in order to be powerful. If you appreciate conversations that go beyond the headline and examine what real-life stories reveal about relationships, power, culture, accountability, and human behavior, Continue watching Life Points with Ronda, asterisk, asterisk, for deeper conversations specifically about betrayal, manipulation, boundaries, relationships, and the lessons we learn when trust is violated. Listen to Love, Lies, and Life Lessons. If you are working on strengthening your financial future and protecting your household in this changing economy, spend some time with the Wealth Reset Pod. And for conversations about spiritual reflection, inner wisdom, alignment, and personal growth, listen to Soul Points. Until next time, remember this: authority must always come with accountability, consent requires freedom, and no survivor should have to prove strength by remaining silent. This is Rhonda, and I will meet you in the next video.